2 hours after I gave birth, my father-in-law walked into my hospital room in a charcoal suit that still carried the cold from outside, looked at my newborn daughter for less than 3 seconds, and announced to everyone present that she would never be recognized as part of the family. "This family needs a male heir," he said in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading numbers off a page. "She will not inherit. She will not be acknowledged. There is nothing personal in it." I looked at my husband, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He had promised for 9 months that he would be the first to hold her. He did not move. He stood by the window with his arms crossed over a suit he had changed into an hour earlier, and he looked at our daughter, the way a man looks at a problem someone else left on his desk. Then he leaned down close enough that only I could hear him, and he said the words that ended our marriage before sunrise. "I already have a son, Isla. He was born 5 months ago. My father has met him. This was never going to go any other way." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even ask him to repeat himself. I looked down at my daughter, still soft and pink, and completely unaware that her father and her grandfather had just erased her in the same breath, and I pulled her closer against my chest, and I smiled. "Then remember this moment," I whispered, "because it is the last one either of you will ever get from us." My father-in-law frowned like I had spoken a language he had never bothered to learn. My husband laughed. He actually laughed, the way you laugh at something small and harmless, something an exhausted new mother says before she comes back to her senses. Neither of them had the faintest idea that within a single year, one of them would lose his marriage, his reputation, and his seat at the company, and the other would be forced to resign from the empire he had spent his entire life guarding. My name is Isla Merritt, and this is the story of the 2 hours that cost the Ashford family everything. Drop it in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing where my global family is tuning in from. It gives me so much strength. Go ahead and type your city and time right now, because what you're about to hear next will completely shock you. 4 years earlier, Grayson Ashford walked into my life the way expensive things always do, quietly and then all at once. I was a financial compliance analyst at a regional lender in Raleigh, the kind of job where you read loan covenants until your eyes ache. He was the heir to Ashford Group, a real estate and hospitality company his grandfather had built from a single row of rental cottages into something that owned skylines in 6 states. We met at a dinner I was never supposed to attend, and by the end of the night he had asked 3 questions about my work and remembered every answer. He never raised his voice. He never checked his phone at dinner. He never once made me feel like an accessory to a life that was already full before I arrived. For the first year, I believed I had found the rarest thing there is, a wealthy man who still remembered how to be kind to a woman who could do nothing for him. His father, Edmund Ashford, ran the company like a man defending a border. In 4 years, he barely spoke a few hundred words directly to me, most of them about weather or traffic. His mother, Vivienne, was polite to me the way people are polite to something they are waiting to replace. I told myself that was simply old money, old manners, old silence. I did not understand yet that in that family, silence was never neutral. It was a decision made carefully and revisited only when it stopped being useful. We married 18 months after we met. In a small courthouse ceremony, he insisted on keeping modest. I remember straightening his tie beforehand because his hands were shaking and thinking that a man that nervous about marrying me could not possibly be capable of the calm, rehearsed cruelty I would meet 3 years later in a hospital room. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about many things, mostly because he was very good at saying scripts like they were simple truths. There is one more person you need to know about, my Aunt Rosalind, my father's older sister. She was a materials scientist, brilliant and impatient, and 30 years ago her small laboratory was bought by Ashford Group when Edmund's father decided the company needed a research and development division. Rosalind took the deal on her own terms. She kept 23% of that division and a voting agreement nobody ever bothered to dissolve. When I told her I was engaged to Grayson Ashford, she went quiet at the dinner table, then asked me a single question. "Does he tell you things before you need them or only after?" I laughed it off. I thought she disapproved of the money. She died 7 months before my daughter was born, and it turned out she had been preparing an answer to a question I had not yet learned to ask. It was during our second year of marriage that I first heard the name Daphne Cole. She was Grayson's executive assistant, sharp-tailored blazers, and a voice that never rose above a calm, even register. At a holiday dinner, I caught her glancing at Grayson across the room with an expression I could not place. Not quite guilt, not quite longing, something closer to exhaustion. Later that evening, she asked me, very carefully, how the nursery planning was going, and excused herself before I had finished answering. I told myself she was not used to small talk with the boss's wife. I did not think about it again for almost 2 years. Before any of that, there were the fertility years, 2 of them, and neither of us spoke about them outside the clinic waiting room. Grayson came to every appointment in the first year, held my hand through 2 procedures that did not take, and told me we had time with a patience I mistook for love. I will never know exactly when his attention split in 2 directions. I only know that somewhere in that second year, while I was crying quietly in parking garages after appointments that went nowhere, another version of the answer he claimed to be waiting for was already underway somewhere else entirely. The small things had already started by then, calls he took in the driveway instead of inside the house, business trips that stretched by a day, then 2, with explanations that were technically plausible and never quite specific. One morning, I found a receipt in his coat pocket from a restaurant 2 towns over, stamped 2 hours earlier than the time he claimed to have left, and I watched him build an explanation in real time over breakfast, a colleague's retirement dinner, a table he joined late, nothing worth remembering. I remember thinking that a man telling the truth does not usually need 3 sentences to explain one dinner. I let it go anyway, because letting things go was easier than becoming the kind of wife who keeps a list. When I finally got pregnant in the spring of our 3rd year, Grayson cried at the ultrasound. I held on to that memory through everything that came after, looking for the seam where the performance ended and the man began, and I never found it. He painted the nursery himself over a single weekend, pale green with white trim. He debated names with me for months, and the week before I gave birth, we agreed on one, Juniper. What I did not know was that Daphne Cole was already raising a son who was 4 months old, or that Edmund had learned about that child months earlier and handed his son an ultimatum. Resolve the situation before the year-end board review, or Edmund would raise it himself, in front of people whose opinion of Grayson mattered more to him than mine ever had. That review fell in the middle of a major refinancing, the largest in the company's history, and it was scheduled for 2 weeks after my due date. And somewhere inside all of that pressure, a colder idea had taken shape in my husband. His father wanted a male heir the way other men want oxygen, and Daphne had given him one. If my baby was a girl, the problem could be made to solve itself. All he had to do was let the 2 facts meet in the same room and stand back while his father did the arithmetic. I was not a wife anymore by then. I was a variable, and I walked into that delivery room believing I was the luckiest woman in the state. The morning I went into labor, Grayson was at the hospital before I finished checking in, pacing with a nervous energy I mistook for excitement instead of guilt. He held my hand through 11 hours of contractions, timed my breathing, and told the nurses twice, unprompted, how ready he was to finally be a father. I think some part of him meant it in the moment, the way an actor can mean a line while he is saying it and still walk off the stage into a different life 5 minutes later. 5. Juniper was born at 17 minutes past 6 on a Tuesday morning. She cried, and the sound filled the room in a way I still cannot describe, except to say that it felt like the beginning of something enormous. I held her against my chest, still trembling, and looked up at Grayson, waiting for him to reach for her the way he had promised for 9 straight months. He did not reach for her. He stepped back toward the window. I asked him gently if he wanted to hold his daughter, and he said no, just no, and something in his voice had gone flat and careful in a way I had never heard before. A few minutes later, he stepped into the hallway, and through the half-open door, I heard fragments of a call. A woman's voice, tight and insistent. Grayson saying, "Low, not like this, not over the phone." What I learned much later was that Daphne had called him twice that morning, and the second time she told him she was done being hidden, that she wanted their son acknowledged before the board review. 20 minutes before that, a message had arrived from his mother. She and Edmund were already on their way to the hospital, and nothing in it suggested either of them intended to pretend there was more than one grandchild worth acknowledging that year. Grayson came back in wearing a fresh suit. He was not dressing for a conversation he wanted to have. He was dressing for one he had run out of ways to avoid. You already know what happened next because I started this story there. 2 hours after my daughter took her first breath, Edmund Ashford stood at the foot of my hospital bed and unmade her with a sentence, "This family needs a male heir." Vivienne studied the flowers on the windowsill. And Grayson, the man who had cried at an ultrasound and painted a nursery green, leaned down and told me about a son named after his grandfather, 5 months old, already met, already approved, already chosen. Not one of them raised their voice. Cruelty in that family never shouted. It scheduled. It arrived in tailored wool, on time, with its sentences already drafted. "You are choosing them," I said. It was not a question. "I am choosing this family's future," Grayson said, as though the two of us were not standing in the middle of it. That was when I smiled and told them to remember the moment, and that was when he laughed. Edmund did not laugh. Edmund looked at me the way a man glances at a line item he has decided is too small to matter, then buttoned his coat and left. He was wrong about the line item. Men like Edmund usually are, exactly once, and it is always the time that counts. I stayed in that hospital for 2 more nights, and I let myself have them, because I did not trust my legs yet, let alone my judgment. Grayson never came back. My sister Colette drove 5 hours from Charleston the moment I called, arriving before sunrise in the clothes she had slept in. She did not ask if I was okay. She asked what I needed, and then she simply took over, holding Juniper so I could sleep in real stretches, planting herself in the corner chair like she intended to outlast anyone who tried to move me. At my own wedding, quietly, over cake, she had told me that Grayson had the kind of politeness that only shows up when someone is watching. I laughed it off then. I did not laugh in that hospital room, finally understanding 4 years too late exactly what she had meant. Somewhere in that second night, I stopped waiting for the door to open. It was on that second night that I finally returned a call I had been avoiding for 3 weeks. Marguerite Hahn, the attorney handling my Aunt Rosalind's estate, had left me 7 voicemails since Rosalind died, and I had let every one of them sit because I was pregnant and happy, and I assumed it was routine paperwork, nothing that mattered next to a first baby. I was wrong about that too, but for once, being wrong was about to work in my favor. Marguerite told me that a year before she died, Rosalind had come to her office unprompted and asked her to review the old acquisition paperwork from the deal that folded her laboratory into Ashford Group. She wanted to be sure the paperwork still meant what it used to mean. Marguerite found something that concerned her enough to keep calling a dead woman's niece for 3 straight weeks. The 23% stake in the Research and Development Division was still intact, still voting, and still governed by an agreement nobody at Ashford Group had ever dissolved. Rosalind never explained why she wanted it reviewed. She only said that some inheritances are worth understanding before you need them, not after. I asked her, from that hospital bed, with my daughter asleep on my chest and my marriage in pieces on the floor, what any of it actually meant for me now. There was a pause on the line, and then Marguerite said the sentence that changed the next year of my life. "It means you have more say in that company than your husband thinks you do." I did not rush anything. I went home first, to the house Grayson and I had shared, because a lawyer with any sense will tell you not to make permanent decisions 3 days after giving birth. Grayson stayed at his parents' estate. His only contact that week was a text asking whether I had taken time to think things over, as though I were the one who needed to reconsider a decision he had made months before I went into labor. He called once on the 4th night, and he did not ask about Juniper. He asked whether I had spoken to anyone at the company, in a tone that told me he already suspected I had. He said he hoped we could keep things civil for everyone's sake, as though civility were something he had only just remembered existed, now that it might cost him something. I hung up without answering and sat listening to Juniper breathe in the bassinet, trying to work out which version of him had ever been real. I spent that week folding impossibly small clothes and standing in the nursery he had painted, running my hand along a wall that suddenly belonged to someone else's marriage. On the fifth night, I started packing, one drawer at a time, not out of rage, but because staying had stopped making sense the moment I admitted it. Colette helped me move that weekend to a rental 2 streets from her own house. By the end of that week, Marguerite and I had gone through Rosalind's folder properly, in daylight, at her office. What those shares gave me was not control of the company. They gave me a binding legal right to request a formal review of executive conduct, any conduct that could expose Ashford Group to reputational or financial risk during any active financing period. And the company happened to be in the middle of the largest refinancing in its history that very quarter. Here is the part that mattered most. As part of that refinancing, Grayson had personally signed certifications to the lenders describing his stable personal circumstances, an affair with a direct employee, a hidden child, 2 competing heirs. That was not a private family matter. That was exactly the kind of conduct the review clause existed to drag into the light. I filed the request through Marguerite at the start of the second week. I did not call Grayson to warn him. He had not called to warn me. 2 weeks after I filed, before the board convened, Daphne Cole called me. I almost did not answer. When I did, she told me she had heard about the review and wanted to say something before it became a spectacle. She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the newborn, a tired I recognized because I had carried an unnamed version of it myself for 4 years. She had moved south alone for the job, no family nearby, and somewhere in the loneliness of that first year working for Grayson, careful attention had started to feel like something it was not. He had promised months into it that he intended to leave me eventually, and by the time she let herself believe him, she was already pregnant, already isolated, already unsure who else she could tell. Then she said the sentence I have never forgotten. He tells people exactly enough to keep them moving in his direction. I asked why she was telling me now. Because someone should walk into that room knowing the truth, she said, instead of finding it out piece by piece in front of an audience. I understood then that Daphne and I had been handed the same performance, staged for 2 different women, each convinced she was the only audience he had. The board meeting happened on a Thursday in a glass room on the 14th floor that smelled like fresh coffee and something colder underneath. I was not required to attend in person. I went anyway, with Juniper asleep in a carrier against my chest, because I wanted Grayson to see exactly who was sitting across the table when he was finally asked to explain himself out loud. Outside counsel asked him, in front of the full board, whether it was true that he had fathered a child with a direct employee while personally certifying stable personal circumstances to lenders in the middle of an active refinancing. Grayson said the situation was being handled privately. Counsel asked whether handled privately included leaving his newborn daughter in a hospital room in front of nursing staff who would remember every detail. For the first time in 4 years, I watched him run out of the right sentence. Then came the part nobody in that room expected, including me. A former colleague of Grayson's, pushed out 2 months earlier over a bonus dispute, sent Marguerite a message thread he had been sitting on out of pure resentment. In it, Grayson joked, months before Juniper was born, that once the heir situation was settled, he planned to quietly separate from Daphne within a year, once the optics no longer mattered, and threaded through those messages were dates showing exactly when Edmund had learned about the second child and what he had instructed his son to do, which was not to disclose it to the board or the lenders, but to manage it quietly before the review. It was not luck that handed us that thread. It was the ordinary consequence of treating people as disposable and assuming none of them would ever compare notes. Daphne sat through the reading of those messages with her hands flat on the table. When it ended, she stood, straightened her blazer, and said the only sentence I ever heard her speak to Grayson directly. You should have told the truth to somebody, anybody, even once, before it cost this much. Then she walked out, and I have respected her ever since. Grayson caught me at the elevators afterward before I could reach the parking garage. He looked smaller in that mirrored box than I had ever seen him, his jaw working like he was searching for a version of himself that could still talk his way out of a room. You planned this, he said. Not quite a question. He needed it to be my fault instead of his own. I did not have to plan anything, I told him. I just stopped covering for you the second you stopped pretending. The doors opened and I walked out with my daughter asleep against my chest, and I did not look back to see whether he followed. What came after was not a clean victory, and I will not pretend it was. The trust language written by Grayson's grandfather's generation required any heir to be born within an intact marriage to hold inheritance priority, and that language created what Marguerite called a genuine succession dispute. Ashford's attorneys argued one reading, Marguerite argued another. There were depositions, disclosures, and an outside mediator brought in to keep the fight out of a courtroom the family wanted to avoid at almost any cost. It took the better part of 4 months running alongside the divorce before it was settled through negotiation. Juniper would hold formal inheritance standing as the only child born inside a marriage on record. Daphne's son would remain entirely outside the company's succession structure, a private matter for Grayson to resolve on his own, without the company behind him. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because I have, many times. Grayson spent a year engineering himself an heir, and he ended it with the daughter he refused to hold, becoming the only child that family was legally bound to provide for. The divorce settlement took those same 4 months. I did not ask for anything vindictive. I asked for what was fair, and with 23% of the research division standing behind me and a board that no longer trusted Grayson with much of anything, fair turned out to be considerably more than either of us expected walking in. And then there was Edmund. The lenders, once they read the outside counsel's report, made governance changes a condition of completing the refinancing, and the report was unambiguous. Edmund Ashford had known about the competing child for months and had chosen to manage the risk quietly rather than disclose it during an active financing. The board voted on a Tuesday. He resigned his executive chairmanship before the vote could be recorded against him, the last piece of control he was ever allowed to keep. They gave him an honorary title, and he held it for 1 season until the trade press would not stop asking about it. And then he gave that up too. The man who stood at the foot of my hospital bed and declared that his family needed a male heir spent his final months at the company watching everything he had protected get restructured around a granddaughter he had once refused to look at for longer than 3 seconds. The custody arrangement was the only part where Grayson briefly resembled the man I thought I had married. He asked for structured visitation, and I let the mediator set reasonable terms, because I wanted to be able to tell Juniper honestly someday that I was not the one who closed every door. He used 3 of his first 6 scheduled visits. He arrived late to 2 of them and cut another short for a work call. By her first birthday, he had stopped scheduling them at all, and no clause, no mediator, and no amount of money ever fixed the part of him that made that choice 2 hours after she was born. Vivian sent 1 letter on the same cream stationery she had used for our wedding invitations, saying she hoped I would understand that these things are complicated. I read it twice and never answered. Some understanding is not owed just because someone finally decides to ask for it after the damage is done. A year on, Edmund asked, through Marguerite, whether he might one day meet Juniper on neutral terms. I said that would be Juniper's decision when she is old enough to make it, and not 1 minute before. He accepted that, which surprised me. A card arrives on her birthday now, signed with a single word. Grandfather. I keep them in a drawer she can open when she is ready, or never, whichever she chooses. Grayson called me once, almost a year after everything, late at night, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it, none of the calm authority left in it at all. He asked if there was still a way to be part of Juniper's life, the way he should have been from the very beginning, before any of this had a chance to happen. I thought about the hospital room and the 2 hours he let me sit there, believing he might still choose us before he decided not to. You had your 2 hours, I told him. I gave you every single day after that to change your mind, and you spent all of them proving you never would. I hung up. I have not heard from him since. Not a card, not a message, not even through Marguerite.
Juniper is walking now, fast and a little reckless, the way toddlers move when they have decided the entire world exists specifically for them to explore. She has my mouth and somebody else's stubborn chin, and she has started asking, in the fragmented way 2-year-olds ask anything. Where her father is, I have not found the right words yet. I do not think there is a version of the truth that fits neatly into a toddler's vocabulary, so for now I tell her he is far away, and I let that be enough, knowing there is a harder conversation waiting for us both somewhere down the road, one I refuse to have before she is actually ready to hear it. We live 2 hours away now, in a quiet house with a crooked garden. Juniper is convinced belongs entirely to her. Colette drives up most Sundays, still smelling faintly of whatever her husband was repairing that week, and she has never once let me live down the fact that she distrusted Grayson's politeness years before I was ready to hear it. Marguerite handles the trust paperwork twice a year, always over coffee, always with the same dry joke about how 3 weeks of unanswered voicemails turned into the most useful legal strategy she never planned to hand anyone. I think about that hospital room more than I probably should. Not the cruelty of it, the exact moment right before I smiled. The half second where I could have chosen to fall apart instead, and something in me quieter than anger and steadier than grief decided not to. Maybe it was Rosalind, waiting patiently inside old paperwork for a moment she never got to see. Maybe it was Colette in the chair beside my bed instead of the man who should have been there. Maybe it is simply what happens when a woman finally runs out of reasons to make herself smaller for people who are never going to notice the effort anyway. Every night before she falls asleep, I tell Juniper the same thing, that the people who are supposed to choose you sometimes will not. And that is not the end of the story. It is the part where you find out who does. Some nights she is asleep before I finish. I say it anyway, quietly, mostly for myself at this point, because it is still the truest thing I know how to tell either of us. Sometimes winning is not revenge. Sometimes it is making sure the next generation never has to beg to be chosen. So let me ask you what I still ask myself. If you had been in that hospital bed with a grandfather erasing your daughter and a husband confessing to a second family in the same 2 hours, would you have smiled the way I did? Or would you have let them see exactly what you were feeling in that moment? Tell me in the comments, because I still think about which one of us truly walked away having won.